When one adds a new mechanic to a game, one would often want to offer reasons to use said mechanic. While function isn't always necessary, it definitely helps leave a lasting impression. And for a small or crunched developer, focusing on mechanics that most players would largely ignore might get in the way of actually finishing the darn game. See, you could call me an artist, and I've been working on my own collection of STEM-based creatures to the point where I'm trying to make a game with them. I can talk more about my project and show off designs later in the video, but today, I wanted to note a missed opportunity Pokemon could have done. Well, they actually did it once, but never again. At the turn of the century, the sequel games Pokémon Gold and Silver were being made to capitalize on the rapidly growing popularity of the franchise. While these games were understandably connected to the previous games, there has to be something new to sell the audience. Back then, the prospect of new characters and designs might have been enough to win the Pokemaniacs over. But Game Freak also took this opportunity to add more mechanics to the game. New elemental types, a day-night cycle, held items, and today's topic, a breeding mechanic. So why would you breed new Pokemon? Since the first games, every Pokemon has a set of individual values, abbreviated to IV. Some were born to be more tanky, some were born to be faster, and some were born just different. There were random values which wouldn't be adjustable by the player for multiple games, which meant that you would have to be lucky to encounter a wild Pokemon with the right stat spread, and these IVs would come to matter in a growing competitive scene. Yeesh, sounds like quite a grind. So if you breed a pair of Pokemon that share an egg group, you can get an egg that hatches into the same species family as the mother, or whoever's not the ditto. The offspring would copy some of the IV stats from the parents, providing a more consistent way of getting a Pokemon with a good IV spread. Alright, while writing the script, apparently Generation 2 had some checks against inbreeding Pokemon, but wildly this check doesn't exist in the games anymore. As a quick aside, future games would have breeding also pass down other important game data like a Pokemon's abilities and nature, but even in Gold and Silver, the parents can pass down certain moves to the offspring, moves that the species would not get to learn if not for the step. These are called egg moves, and yet there was another reason to use the breeding mechanic. Baby Pokemon. Alright, so Gold and Silver were sequels to the first games, right? So it makes sense to have a creature roster that also references the original 151. This included rivalries and counterparts, new evolutions, and the inverse, pre-evolutions. Pokemon really didn't want to admit retcons, especially this early into the franchise, so these new additions to the evolutionary lines were always explainable, like, oh silly, the older Pokemon could have always evolved, you just didn't have the right item. And for the case of the babies, you never saw them in the wild because they're only observable when they're hatched in captivity, which could only be done through this breeding mechanic. So, as a kid, I personally found pre-evolutions to be lacking. See, I didn't hate the designs. In fact, I liked some of the designs more than I did the originals, but when they grew up, they ended looking the same as the old design. Sure, this extra stage offers even more egg moves, but they sounded like an excuse to extend the grind and make more marketable plushies. Pokemon would continue to add new pre-evolutions for 2 more generations, but now they can't use their old excuse because other older Pokemon are getting pre-evolutions, even though breeding was a thing when they didn't. So Pokemon introduced incenses, held items with specific effects, but when a parent holds the right incense, the baby Pokemon can be hatched instead of the adult one. In fact, by Generation 4, most baby Pokemon are now out in the wild. Was it worth having a new design that was hard to use but would also evolve to lose the design's novelty? Of course, now I can say that not everything needs to be functionally viable, and it's perfectly fine to have temporary designs, especially if you're still raking in money through the merchandise. But Pokemon must have agreed with this sentiment, as no old Pokemon received a new pre-evolution after this 4th generation. There was one more baby Pokemon with Toxel, but they were introduced with their adult forms, instead of adding a baby to a pre-existing line. In fact, by the 9th generation, the retcon was in full effect, as the eggs of evolution lines with baby forms now always hatch into the baby, regardless of the presence of an incense. In contrast, new evolutions are still being made to this day. So, Pokemon has more or less retired this baby trope, but I felt like they missed an opportunity here. Which is weird, because, again, Pokemon has done this once, but never again. Alright, so I explained how babies work in Pokemon and why one might go out of their way to get the baby form. Instead of making this mechanic more desirable, Pokemon decided to make them more accessible by making them appear in the wild, skipping the breeding mechanic. But what if the baby forms could be desirable without skipping a mechanic? See, why do we continue to see new evolutions? Sure, they're easier to justify and achieve, but are they perhaps also more exciting to use in the game? With a new evolution, not only is there a stronger new design to play with, but after the 5th generation, the old design also gets a buff, as non-fully evolved Pokemon can hold the Eviolite item, which boosts their defenses, to the point where some species become competitively viable. How can baby designs yield more exciting gameplay other than learning a few specific moves? Now, all the way back in Generation 2, there was a special baby Pokemon named Tyro. This baby would come from Hitmonchans and Hitmonlees, officially connecting them into the same evolution family. By level 20, if Tyro has more attack than defense, they become a Hitmonlee. More defense than attack, they become Hitmonchans. But if the attack and defense are the same, they become the newly introduced Hitmontop. This is what I'm talking about. Why not have the new pre-evolution also have a new branching evolution that's not accessible in the wild and requires this baby step? I think that will be a rather cool reward that visually sticks out. So yeah, when pre-evolutions of past designs are being made, I wish more of them had access to grow up into a new design. So, to illustrate my point in this Pokemon setting, I drew a few designs for today, starting with a new evolution for Chingling. Gen 3's Chimecho is a single stager who received a baby form in the following generation, Chingling. So, Chimecho is the Japanese Furine wind chime, and Chingling is a jingle bell. So, why not make this new evolution a tubular wind chime with Chimber? Is making this a psychic steel type irresponsible as it lacks symmetry from Chimecho? I shouldn't care. Pokemon broke symmetry many times before. And that's the thing with these fan-made designs, right? It's really up to the artist of how close or loose they want to stick to a convention. If one disagrees with the artist, they should pick the pencil up themselves, as they would know the best about their own preferences. The twos are psychically maintained to float as they use their wide hip to bang on them. Honestly, I think Chimber would have been more interesting if they were introduced with a baby that was only accessible through breeding. What I'm doing now is basically just adding a new branched evolution to a pre-existing Pokemon. So for this to truly take effect, let's take a Pokemon and give it a baby that can grow into a new design. I ended up choosing Torkoal, another single stage Gen 3 mon. As Torkoal was a furnace, I wanted to make a smaller, more bug-like design, like a thermos. However, during the drawing process, I tried to pivot into a sippy cup, but felt like I drew more of a pacifier. Maybe I could have done better on another day, but I was honestly trying to avoid a previous Testodyne design I made for my personal project. So this baby is normal type, where, again, Pokemon has had other designs evolve into completely new typings, and the baby Azurill was like this for a long time until they added the fairy type across the line. My main reason for making this hatchling a normal type was because I couldn't justify making it a fire ice type, as their other evolution would be a cooler turtle. Cooler as in the container, like a refrigerator. Torkoal looks more like a painted turtle than a tortoise, but that's the fun with branched evolutions, right? You could take a concept and go a different unique direction. In fact, if there's a Pokemon you want to do another take on, making a Prevo and then a branched evolution from that can offer more variety other than just giving the old design a new evolution. There's a lot of tools to add to a family now, and even though Pokemon appears to have ended pre-evolutions, I still think they could have had potential in introducing more designs that would leave a lasting impression. I close off my videos by talking about the creature collector that I'm working on, Stemma. But I don't plan on having a breeding mechanic in Stemma, as I already have a lot of other mechanics on my plate to iron out, so I think it's best for me to limit my scope. Don't worry, I don't have anything like Pokemon's internal values, as every Stemma stat should be adjustable in a certain range. That part is only half implemented, I need the UI for it, but I'm getting there. Trust me, I have a lot of ideas for a potential breeding mechanic, like the branching idea I just shared with you today, but all these plans are pushed behind my other priorities, that I don't plan on the main game to have this mechanic. This includes a previous line I actually showed off with my Snapdragons, who are representing incomplete dominance. I think it's best to introduce these kind of stemmas through this potential breeding chapter. I won't be working on those as I need to limit my scope for the main game. But since I just talked about pushing back on the design, let me show off another line I intend to use in my base game, which was a past design I didn't want Torkoal to resemble too closely. I always wanted to make a stemma on permafrost, which is soil that has been frozen for centuries due to being in colder areas of our world. But before talking about that, I also have a previous stage. So water expands when they're frozen because making hydrogen bonds to crystallize takes up more space than jiggling around as a liquid. Sure. So when water in the dirt freezes during the colder seasons, the ice would occupy more volume. Even more so as pools of ice start to form something called ice lenses, which heaves the soil up. This is called frost heaving. So I have the Geocryostemma heaveling, a little turtle guy whose shell represents the cracks and upheaval of land caused by the frozen water in the soil. And heavelings advance into frostudines, who has a thick layer of permafrost on their back. I actually changed their design a little bit from this 2022 version, but I'll need to draw the shaded version some other day. Now, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the ongoing threat with the loss of permafrost. As the climate changes, more permafrost is starting to thaw every year. Not only does this cause landslides and floods and unleash diseases from centuries ago, which is already really seriously bad, but on top of that, the decomposing matter in the permafrost could release even more greenhouse gases to cause even more climate change. These Save the World campaigns honestly put it too lightly, because Earth would still be floating in space even if we can't live in it. What we're really doing is that we're trying to save ourselves as our bodies and societies depend on the current conditions across the globe that we call nature. I just hope that you can at least understand and be aware when you hear these kind of terms. Look, I believe if you're aware of what you're looking at, you as a human can find new solutions and hope. I personally doubt that Pokemon would make any new pre-evolutions of previous lines anymore, but why should that stop you? Tired of regionals and new evolutions? You could try making a new baby and then branch off of that. At least that's one more method you could add to your arsenal of possibilities. I'll still be developing my game as I make these videos, so if you're interested in my journey, follow along. I want to thank my Patreon supporters for directly supporting me as I post weekly snapshots of my progress to my highest tier. But you could always support me for free by just liking and sharing this video. Alright, thank you for watching till the end of the video, and I hope you'll have a nice one till next time.